I was chatting to this guy and he was like, oh, you're a female founder. You're like a commodity that everyone wants right now. And I'm like, yeah, you read about all these things. And like, he thought, oh, you have an advantage. But actually, when you look at the stats, so it's even worse because people think you have an advantage and you really don't. So that's, even more painful.
You're listening to Not My First Guess. I'm Hattie Willis, your host, and each episode I talk to an entrepreneur, investor, or startup expert to unpack their hardest moments, biggest wins, and hard-earned advice so we can shortcut our learnings as founders together. Today I'm joined by Jessica Alderson, co-founder and CEO of SoSynced, a dating app and website based on the 16 personality types theory. SoSynced is the first dating app to connect compatible personality types by pairing couples who have just enough similarities to understand each other and just enough differences to create a spark. After breaking up with her boyfriend of 3 years who she'd moved to Australia with, Jess returned to London ready to date again, but was left disappointed after meeting people on dating apps and not feeling a real connection. Jess and her sister, now co-founder Lou, were having drinks one night and agreed there had to be a better way to date. Their colleagues and friends were also wasting a ton of time on bad dates, and it was clear why. Personality compatibility is the key to an amazing relationship, but dating apps are still matching people on the basis of a couple of photos. It just didn't make sense to them, and they believed there had to be a better way to help people find exciting, fulfilling, and long-lasting relationships. Thus, SoSynced was born. With a match on SoSynced being 7 times more likely to result in a conversation compared to the industry average, Jess and Lou are proving their theory right. SoSynced already has 400,000 users globally and an almost 50-50 split of male-female, which is super rare on dating apps, as they're typically more heavily male-weighted. And this has helped lead to an exceptionally high success rate of people finding love through the app, including a wedding less than a year after launching and recently welcoming their first SoSynced baby. In this episode, we discuss the real power of true success stories, a better way to find investment, how to stand out in an overcrowded market, overcoming personality bias in the workplace, finding the right CTO and tech team as non-technical founders, the cost of customer acquisition, and why we all need to talk more about the value of the right co-founder personality match. So without further ado, let's get started. So first and foremost, Jess, welcome to the episode. And it's quite exciting. For those of you who can't see, we're actually recording this face to face. I'm sat next to Jess on the sofa, which is for us very new. So Jess, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to be passing a microphone between two of us because in true startup style, my second microphone did not arrive in time. But I really want to kick in with your story. How did you get into startups? What was your journey? Was entrepreneurship something you always thought you'd do? And if you did, what was the expectation versus the reality?
Sure. So I've had quite a kind of random journey in a way. So I studied chemistry at university, did a master's in chemistry as well, and then went into banking. So I did that for 5 years. And during that time, I moved to Australia with my partner at the time. And someone had basically introduced me to personality types during my time in banking. So I'd been using it in a corporate sense. And when I was in Australia, I actually ended up breaking up with my partner and I was leaving my job in banking at the same time. And I just decided to take a year out and travel. Just had been working super long hours and just really wanted to read about things I was interested in. It's obviously a complete luxury to be able to do that. And so because I had this breakup, it really sparked this interest in how personality types relate to love, dating, and compatibility. So I spent the best part of that year researching that in lots of different ways. And the findings were like so extreme. They were incredible. It was just, we would never say that 2 personality types could never work, but you can definitely massively increase your chances. And so, I got back to London. I was telling my sister Lou about this, and she was kind of skeptical. She didn't really know that much about personality types at that point. And then we went round and analyzed all the couples that we knew. So like her friends, my friends, family friends. And she was like, wow, there's a lot to this. And it turned out she'd been in a long-term relationship with her perfect personality match. And they are getting married in just over a month. So, really cute. And they do just work so well together for the exact reasons that the theory would suggest. So yeah, we were both working at other companies when we first set up So Synced. And then in March 2021, raised our first funding round. And that enabled us to really, I guess, take everything to the next level and to become what I call a real company, having employees, things like that. And yeah, that's the kind of background. And I guess, yeah, I wasn't really super involved in the startup world up until So Synced. So it's very much focused on finance and it's very different. And entrepreneurship wasn't something that really was on my mind, like from really, I guess, until having the idea. I was never like, I want to set up my own business. It just happened. But I guess I did have some expectations, even though I hadn't thought about it for a long period before that. And it has been, probably everyone you talk to on the podcast says this, but much harder than I expected. Lots more ups and downs. It's a complete roller coaster, like on a daily basis, and also just big picture as well.
So much there to dive into. I guess the first thing is, let's talk about the co-founding relationship, because this is your sister.
Yeah.
They say don't get into business with friends and family half the time, but loads of people do, and it does work. So what convinced you that actually that was a good idea? And also, what have been the challenges of that and the wins of that? Because I can imagine, as you said, like the startup journey is just generally more extreme. Yeah. It's massive highs, massive lows. So maybe you can share some of that and how you've coped, and maybe if there are any tips around managing that really tricky co-founder dynamic that you've learned. And our editor, Catherine, who's a genius, has just interjected with a really smart question, which is, how does your co-founder personality type play out? So if you can tell us a little bit about that co-founder pairing and your experiences and what we can learn.
Yeah, sure. So it was never really a question of would we do it together or not. We were just talking. I literally went to her flat the very next day and we were like, how do we do this? We never even had the discussion of should we go into business together? I don't know if that's wise or not, but it has been really good. It has been just like amazing. And we are almost the opposite personality types, which actually has been great. You might think it would cause friction, but it's more the opposite. There's certain areas where I'm like, Lou, what do you think about this? And she's like, yeah, this. And then vice versa. We very much have our kind of areas and where we have the final say. And it's not even a kind of like battle of who has the final say. It's just putting a complete trust in, oh, she knows this area. She can make this decision and I trust that. And I think of us as almost the same person, if that makes sense, because I think she's family. So when I think, oh, we own X% of the company now, I think that we own, or like we are one entity. And I just have, like the ultimate trust in her. And hopefully she would say the same about me. So like we definitely have had our challenges, but that co-founder dynamic hasn't really been one of them. We just are mostly on the same page, but different enough to have those helpful and useful discussions where we do have different perspectives.
And just picking up on this thread, because often I think it's a mistake people make with co-founders is that we're sometimes attracted to people who are too similar. And actually often what you want is someone who will challenge you and push you. And picking up on this thread of what you've seen in the dating world, because I know people will be super curious. And for anyone who hasn't met Jess, she will very quickly be able to tell your personality type and predict your partners, which is scary if it doesn't match. In my case, thank God it did. But can you tell us a little bit more about what are you looking for? Like, are you looking for, because I assume it's actually similar in both senses, both dating and even in a co-founder match. You talked about like, how much do you want to be similar? How much do you want to be different? What is the right balance?
Yeah. So I think the ways in which you want to be similar and different are different depending on the dynamics. For dating, it's different to friendship. It's different to a co-founder relationship. For dating, that's where we spent the most time, I guess, like gathering research. And now, our algorithm is based on this like fairly large data set, which is really exciting. And I mean, for dating, we essentially pair couples who have just enough similarities to form a strong connection, to have great conversations on a daily basis, and to understand each other, which is super important. But then just enough differences to create that spark, that sense of intrigue, and really catapult it from what would be a kind of platonic relationship to something that's like sexy, fun and exciting. And yeah, we would say it's more ideal to have slightly more differences than similarities. But then, as I guess was getting at the beginning, the types of similarities and differences matter too. It's if you're similar in one way, it's very different to another. So yeah, we obviously take that into account with the matching algorithm.
And so for anyone who doesn't know the 16 personalities, can you explain broadly what it looks at and just a little bit of how it works and what it can help people understand?
Yeah, sure. So you have 16 personality types, as you probably guessed, and each personality type is made up of 4 letters. So the first letter is I or E. You're an introvert or an extrovert. Most people know those terms already. The second letter is N or S. So you're an intuitive or a sensor. Intuitives focus on the big picture. They're more abstract. They like talking about theories, what if questions. And sensors are the opposite. They don't really see the point in talking about lots of what ifs. They're very grounded. They're very practical, realistic, more present in the moment. Then the third letter is T or F. So you're a thinker or a feeler. Thinkers more focus on logic when making decisions, use their head rather than their heart. And then feelers are more the opposite. They take into account their values, how it will impact the people involved. And then the fourth letter is P or J. So you're a perceiver or a judger. Perceivers are more go with the flow, like to keep their options open, don't like to plan too much. And judges prefer structure, routine. They like to have a clear plan and they like to stick to it. So yeah, you're an ENFP, right?
Yeah, I think so. And funnily enough, it's just this funny context. One of the things that I think people really misunderstand about this, or I've experienced, is that it's all on a spectrum, right? So some things you will be I'm a very clear E. I get a ton of energy from spending time with other people, and that really helps me recharge. It's not just about, I think people also think extroversion is like just that you like being on stage or you like being outgoing. Like you can be really outgoing, you can be the life and soul of a party, and it just drains you. And I think it's interesting when we have these like co-founder conversations, is like remembering that spectrum question, because often you think someone is, they're just more extreme than you. It doesn't mean you're actually not on the same part of the spectrum.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And have you noticed kind of personality differences or similarities in co-founders? Because you've probably met a lot now, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think the ones that do best have got that difference. And I think as much as anything, to your point, like you want to be able to own different areas of the business. Yeah. And if you both get super energized by the same parts, and it's not just a personality thing, but more broadly, then I think it becomes really tricky. And so like in my co-founder pairing, I love speaking. I get a huge amount of energy from it. My co-founder doesn't. And actually, if we both always wanted to be on stage, like maybe that would be an issue. Yeah. It works quite well for us that he's like, no, you go and talk, and I get a ton of energy from it. But then he is really good in grounding me in other areas. Yeah. So really helpful to like find that. And we talk a lot about in our dynamic is like, there's never actual tension. Like it never feels stressful, but it's healthy tension of he will say, well, I'm not sure about that. Can I challenge you? And that's always helpful.
Yeah, for sure. That's really important in any co-founder relationship, to just have diverse perspectives, really. And yeah, like you said, own different parts of the business.
So I want to dig into now how you test a dating app, because it's something we've spoken about before. Like maybe it's something you would do a little bit differently in the early stages now, but you actually have done really well. So this is not coming from a failure place, but maybe just a reflection place. How did you go about getting started? What were some of the learnings in the early stages, maybe before the first fundraise, and then we'll come on to funding?
Yeah, sure. So we built a kind of first version of So Synced, and now being much more involved in the startup world, I know that there's better ways to test without building a full product. But I guess we also just were very confident. We had talked to a lot of people. We saw online that people were out there literally saying, I'm looking for this personality type. Where can I find them? So we definitely knew there was demand for it. We didn't know quite how much. And so we built a very simple first version, which when I look back at it now, if apps existed in the 60s, it would have been that kind of app. I'm like cringing when I'm thinking about it. But yeah, so we launched this version, and yeah, people just started finding us because, like I said, people were looking for people of certain personality types, and it caught on pretty quickly just through word of mouth. And then actually we did quite a lot on social media. So this is during COVID, actually. We launched the kind of test version at the beginning of COVID. And so, yeah, also personality types blew up on social media during that time because I think people had time to introspect. They were sitting at home all day. They were looking for entertainment. So that was a great way of getting it out there in the early days. And then we realized that platform just wouldn't really scale very well. And that was a really stressful time, actually, because it was just super slow. We were making all these technical adjustments, but when you change something here, it was then not giving people as relevant matches, that kind of thing, but they were just temporary adjustments we had to make. And we were quite naive in the beginning in terms of the tech. We were like, oh, you just pay some developers and they'll build a good product and then it will all work. But as I'm sure that's not the case. So then actually we brought a technical advisor, kind of part-time CTO on board, and basically decided to rebuild it all from scratch, and it was very much necessary. And that's while we were raising our first funding round. And then, closed it in March 2021, and we launched the new version of the app just before that. So all good timing to really get going.
And I just want to dig in on that technical piece, because you're two non-technical founders. And I think this is super common, the mistakes that you made around how you can outsource it. Can we just dive in a little bit on what were your learnings around why it was so difficult to outsource it? And then what were some of the challenges and how did you go about finding a CTO? Because actually that's really hard. Everyone underestimates, like, oh, if we can't outsource it, we'll just hire a CTO. Every founder I speak to is like, yeah, just do that.
Yeah, that was fate. So 2 weeks before lockdown, I'd gone to a friend's birthday lunch, and she's one of my best friends. I'm seeing her tomorrow, actually. And I sat opposite this guy who was like, oh, I work in tech. If you ever need any help, just give me a call. So I took his number, and I guess it was probably 2 or 3 months later when we started to have these scaling issues. I was like, had talked to our developers. It wasn't really working still. They didn't really know how to get to the bottom of the issue. I called him up, and it was like super late one night, and I was like, I just don't know what to do. Can you please help us? And he also had more time than usual because it was lockdown. So then we started working together quite closely, and he actually spent a lot of time on it in the early days in particular. So that was pretty lucky, really. And then he helped us we actually rebuilt the next platform with new developers, and he helped us find them because he's got a great network in the tech world. But I also just found that it's quite helpful to ask designers if they know people, just anyone in that tech world, using your network, really. And then, I would say he then essentially did like code reviews of the new code, and that made all the difference, because I think one of the mistakes, or the main mistake we made as non-technical founders, was not realizing how different the quality of the code can be. We thought it was fairly standard, but that's definitely not the case. And technical people listening to this are probably like have their heads in their hands right now. But it was just something we were super naive about.
I think it's really common because it's always the way, right? We underestimate people who are very good at their jobs, make it look easy. And so it's easy to underestimate just how skilled it is.
Yeah.
And we're used to seeing it on TV and it looks really simple. So definite note for those listening who are non-technical. I think there's a really great tip in there of, if at all possible, whether it's through angel investors, whether it's through your network, to get someone who you can actually ask to bring their expertise to help you find a new expert. This is often the way when you find someone who can't be your CTO, but you actually know they're super capable. Maybe ask them if, as a transition, they might be able to help you find a new CTO. Not always the case, but if at all possible, super recommended.
Yeah. And also, I think just having someone that you really trust, just like, even if it's one person, it was a really close friend of a close friend, we just completely trusted him, and that made all the difference. And you can't always do that. It's hard. But if you can find someone with a certain level of trust to help you oversee everything and make good decisions, that definitely makes a huge difference.
So I want to come now to fundraising. So you've got a product that is evolving and you have users. Why did you decide now's the time? And also, how did you go about that process of actually educating yourself on fundraising? What were some of the kind of expectations versus reality in that piece?
Yeah. So, yeah, we had a product with users and it just, it seemed like an obvious thing to do, reading about other dating apps journeys. And also, I guess, just seeing how we were running so synced at that time. We had full-time jobs. We couldn't afford to pay ourselves a salary. We weren't monetizing. So we were like, if this is going to turn into a real company, we definitely need a certain amount of money. It's sometimes hard to know exactly how much you need. And so we were like, right, fundraise. And again, we're very naive about fundraising. And I assumed, I was like, oh, coming from a banking background, I know the kind of finance language. Like my job was pitching to investors for 5 years. I was like, I can understand investor psychology, but I didn't realize how hard it would be to fundraise. And unfortunately, with biases as well, and such a tiny portion going to female founders, it was 100 times harder than I expected. So I saw our stats and I compared them to historical dating apps who had raised X amount, Y users. And I was like, we've got a lot of users given we haven't spent money on marketing. So I was super confident. I put together a pitch deck, like started reaching out, probably reached out to 100 or 150 people maybe through LinkedIn, found profiles on Angel List. And I got one reply and I was like, oh, this is not what I was expecting. So that was the kind of first shock in the fundraising journey. And I did change the email. It's not like and I also read so many blog posts about the perfect outreach email to angel investors and funds. So I tried all these different creative subject lines. One was like, lonely dating app looking for investor to go for walks to talk about valuation, something like that. I tried all kinds of things, but they weren't working. So then I actually started doing these calls on Lunch Club, which I don't know if you've ever used it. It's a networking platform. And you basically say, I'm free on Thursday at 5 p.m. I'm free on Monday lunchtime. And then they just pair you with random people. Because I was like, I can't keep reaching out to people. It's just, I'm never going to get anywhere. So I thought, at least if I start doing this networking thing, I'll have real conversations with real people. And because I was personalizing the messages as well. So 20 minutes, half an hour that I'd spend personalizing an email, I'm actually having a conversation with a real person. And it's much easier to build rapport that way. So I did eventually close to 100 calls on Lunch Club and found a lead investor. So it was so exhausting because I was working a full-time job and running so synced with users at the time. My life is just complete chaos, and I'd get to the end of the working day and it'd be now a Lunch Club call, but it was just necessary. And I went for some drinks with female founders last night, and one of them said, what was the low point of your fundraising journey? And I actually think for me, it was when I discovered, oh, there are funds that are out there that are set up to help female founders, or there's lots of talk about this in the press. And then I reached out to those funds and none of them replied again. And it was the last glimmer of hope had kind of gone. Or that was just before I found Lunch Club. So there was another glimmer of hope. And that was tough. I was like, surely this will be the kind of the changing factor, but it wasn't. And I think you've probably seen that as well. That's something that I'm pretty upset about, is that there's lots of talk about it. And I saw someone I was at a party on Saturday and was chatting to this guy, and he was like, oh, you're a female founder. You're a commodity that everyone wants right now. And I'm like, yeah, you read about all these things. And he thought, oh, you have an advantage. But actually, when you look at the stats, so it's even worse because people think you have an advantage and you really don't. So that's, even more painful, which is probably something you noticed as well.
Yes. Yeah. It's so painful, but it's great to hear another perspective on it, because I think, and you did do it, And I think you kept persevering. And I think just on the personality note, you being more introverted, that must have been so draining.
Yes, it was so draining. I look back and I'm like, that was just like a long period of exhaustion, really. But yeah, necessary. And I do actually, in some ways, quite enjoy investor conversations. It depends on the investor, but I'm always keen to hear their perspectives, and they have seen lots of different companies. So the conversations themselves, in a way, I find quite energizing. But I guess in context of just, like kind of social energy or social battery, it was definitely a tiring time.
And so you do close around, you find a lead investor. Any other lessons? And maybe we can put some numbers to it in terms of how much you raised at the different stages.
Yeah, sure. So we raised, our first round was like $1 million exactly. And I would say one of the main learnings was intros are so important. So as soon as I started networking, and so it wasn't only finding a lead investor on Lunch Club, I would talk to different people and they'd be like, oh, I know an investor who works at this fund, or I know an angel investor who works here, and just entered the startup circle in a way, if that makes sense. And then getting meetings was much easier. Still not always easy, but I think that's probably my main learning, is to spend time networking and then getting introductions rather than just like reaching out again and again. And reaching out does work for some people, so I would never say never do that. But for me, introductions have worked so much better.
So really would love to unpack a little bit around first raise compared to later raises. And I know people often say that the first raise is the hardest. Would you agree with that? What's been your experience raising the second time? How long did they both take you as well, comparatively?
Yeah, so the first raise, it was probably 7-8 months. And that was not doing it full time. So that was working a full-time job and running SoSync. So I couldn't spend so much time on it each week, but it was a long process. That was to like, I guess, the very first email to like the, money in the bank. And yeah, definitely so we raised another round last year, and that definitely was a lot easier. That was like mostly done probably within a month or so. And like some of that was follow on investment from our existing investors. Some of it was new investors, but it was just so much easier. By that time, I was in WhatsApp groups with lots of female founders in particular, but just general startup WhatsApp groups as well, and kind of had actually made really good friends with a lot of other founders. So asked them, oh, do you know any relevant investors? So it was much, much easier to get meetings. And I guess also we then this kind of history, and this is what we've done over the past kind of year or so. They've seen that we've used the money well. So yeah, the second raise was much better, really.
So I feel like dating apps is quite a crowded market. There are massive players there. And I feel like there are other people who are going to be building businesses and wondering, actually, both in terms of execution, what you found in terms of how hard it is to acquire customers, but also in terms of the investment angle. Was that a big worry for you? How did investors think about it?
Yeah, so I think it wasn't a huge worry for us at first, because we were just so confident in the idea. We're like, this is obviously going to work, and obviously people will see this. But I think a lot of founders are like that, particularly with the first fundraise. And it is a crowded market, and it is very hard to raise money for a dating app or as a dating app. So I think there are 20,000 dating apps in the world, which is crazy. Yeah. And I'm not sure any, or maybe a handful, have become profitable or been successful in the past, say, 8 years, at least startups. There are dating apps that are born out of like conglomerates, Match Group. It's different because they have just funding just there and then. It is a particularly tough, I think consumer tech in general is quite hard to fundraise for, and dating apps, I would say, is on the harder end of even that spectrum. And the investors that we have just did get it. Like we had the personality type angle, which is a huge market in itself, like personal development, self-awareness. When you look at the stats, I love looking at kind of the stats, sometimes on a monthly basis, but I have looked at them on a yearly basis as well, because it's probably more accurate. But if you look at the trends of interest and personality types, it's literally gone like that. So I see it as this like really just long-term structural trend towards personality types, and also towards fulfilling healthy relationships. As those needs become more complex, you actually look for more from your relationships. Hundreds of years ago, it'd be like, oh, a partner, great. You don't really care too much if they like understand you on a deep level or not, but now you do. So yeah, I find that really exciting for us.
I want to come back to how you grew your usership in what is a hard market, an expensive space to acquire customers if you're just paying for ads. So what were some of the learnings around acquiring these kinds of customers?
Yeah, sure. So I would say, we've tried lots of different things, tested lots of different things, and some have worked better than others. But how we've acquired our users, it has been just a mixture of different things. So at first, when we launched the test app, we didn't have a marketing budget. People found us. I'm kind of amazed at how many people found us without really getting out there, because we had a succinct Instagram account, but I think we had 300 followers at the time. But then, as I mentioned, during COVID, we then grew our social media following, particularly on Instagram. We would often reach, I don't know, like close to 1 million people a month on Instagram. So like our posts would get, say, like 8,000 likes. Some of them would get 12,000 likes, which were actually way more than like Tinder and Bumble at the time, which was cool. And that was like part of the kind of pitch to investors. We're like, oh, our social media is actually, our engagement level is 25 times higher. So they could see that people were really engaging in personality types. So first kind of year, it was really just social media and word of mouth, like organic growth. And then when we raised money, we then tested different digital ads channels, and some, worked better than others. There's lots of different factors you need to take into account, obviously, kind of, acquisition cost, retention, and eventually lifetime value of a customer. And what I didn't realize is how nuanced it would be balancing all those factors. In my mind, it was like, oh, you have one clear acquisition channel, but actually one might be better on acquisition cost, another might be better on revenue per monthly active users. So you have to make some decisions that aren't always super clear as to what is the best option.
That's such an important point to pause on, because I do think we get very wrapped up in customer acquisition costs when we think about marketing channels, and particularly for subscription apps, there are other more important metrics like churn, because if you're churning that customer, however cheap they were to acquire, they can end up costing you more than someone who's more expensive. And I think this is maybe a good time to start talking about business model, because you have that deep understanding of what are our core metrics for success. So can you tell us a little bit about how that's evolved?
Yeah, sure. So it was really the first year and a half or just over that we didn't monetize at all. And then it was October of 2021. So shortly after the fundraise that we launched our first subscription package. And there's been a lot of testing around what people will pay for when it comes to dating. So we started with, I guess, fairly standard monetized dating app features. And we obviously did have lots of personality type features as well, mostly free. We did do one kind of personality type feature in the subscription package. And again, we were like, we'll launch it. We'll have 5 to 10% of users paying. That's typical for a dating app. Mostly they're freemium models. So people sign up for free and then have the option to pay for extra features. And that completely makes sense, because having that quantity of users is really important. Making sure that people can sign up for free is pretty essential, really. Depending on the type, you can get away with not doing that. But the majority of dating apps, that is the best way to do it. But so again, we weren't magically at that kind of 5 to 10% range. That did take like testing in terms of like how we marketed it, and I know positioning of paywalls and timing of paywalls and things like that. And also, to be honest, monetizing different features. We did testing around that too. So that took, a little bit of time really to reach that kind of point that we wanted to. And yeah, I mean, retention is super important for dating apps, as you can probably imagine. And something that we sometimes get pushback on, or we did when we were fundraising, is, oh, but if you're successful, then you lose a customer. And okay, yes, you do, it's true. But like word of mouth is so important for dating apps. It's such a great way to let more people know about it. And success stories are just the best marketing channel you can have, really. Because if you think about, like, you know, I guess you have a partner, so you haven't used dating apps for a while. But when you talk to people about, oh, how did you find this dating app? They're like, oh, this friend told me about it. Or, oh, my friend found their partner on it. And we see that with press. That's another kind of acquisition channel that we use. We do like a lot of press features. And when you have stories about success stories, people getting married, things like that, people like flock to the app. They're like, it's good inspiration, and they can see that actually it does work. And we have actually had lots of marriages now, which is pretty cute. Yeah. Had our first SoSync baby born recently. So yeah, had like really cute pictures sent to us. So it is, yeah, it's incredible to see like the real impact on people's lives. And someone actually sent us like an album of their relationship to when they first met on SoSync to getting married the other day. And that was incredible because it was like really personal photos of like that you'd see of your friends. And I was like, this is, yeah, really amazing.
And I think that is such an important point around actually where there is kind of, you designed to lose customers, but then you think about that. And often I get a little frustrated with founders who tell me just word of mouth is their acquisition channel because it's really hard to control.
Yeah.
But actually, I think there are some cases where you do know it's just much more likely. Like everyone who is dating that I've ever known, who's dating on dating apps, is telling everyone they know in their friendship groups about it. Yeah. Like I've got like multiple friends who've met on dating apps. I can tell you which dating app they all met on. Exactly. I remember it because it's part of their story. My friend named their dog Bumble because it's part of their story. And so I think there is this interesting piece of actually, this is a really good example of word of mouth because actually, you can bake it into what you put in the press and what you put on your social media, but also it's actually a predictable thing that people talk about as opposed to a new B2B SaaS. And it's like, yeah, maybe they're going to tell people, but what is the mechanic for that? Are you sure that behavior is happening? Are you really betting your business on that, which you don't control?
Yeah, I always say we put together the two most interesting things in the world and the two most interesting topics of conversation. You yourself, like your personality type, people love to know more about themselves. Like, you know, we hear stories of our success stories telling their friends about it at dinner, and then everyone at the dinner party is on the table taking the SoSync personality test. So there's that angle. And then, yeah, everyone loves to talk about dating and love and relationships, and particularly if it's a new couple, how they met. And it's so interesting that you said you could know or by heart which dating apps your friends met on. Like, I'm not surprised because you do remember things like that and you definitely talk about it. So yeah, but then I do agree with you as well, is that it is, you can't just rely on word of mouth, and you do need to get it out there somehow. So yeah, social media was like big for us in the early stages, and it's really big for us as well now. And I think that's where we have a major advantage over other dating apps, is that personality type content tends to do really well. So like over the past month, we've seen almost 4 million views on TikTok. So you're reaching a lot of people through like social media and content. So that's always been the direction I wanted us to go in, and it definitely will remain like that in the future, is to do a lot on kind of content really to get the message out there and not just rely on digital ads, because that it can be dangerous. And not to say they don't have a role. I think they are really useful and we use them more or less at different times, but to supplement other acquisition channels. But yeah, the word of mouth thing is difficult as well because it takes time, particularly for success stories as a dating app. Like people need to get into a relationship, they need to find each other, then date, and then spread the word. So it's not an overnight thing for a lot of consumer tech companies.
And one of the really interesting things about SoSync is that actually you have much better balance of male female than typical dating apps, but also what are the challenges around making sure that you're actually being inclusive and building that liquidity both on a same-sex partnership but also for LGBTQ plus users.
So yeah, acquiring women in the dating world tends to be harder than acquiring men, and that is something that typically dating apps struggle with. So stats that I've read suggest that 2/3 of dating app users are men and 1/3 are women. But then men spend a lot longer on the dating apps. So in terms of like kind of screen time, there's like quite a big skew, and you never really want that. It's everyone ideally to find a partner, and that would require kind of 50-50 split or thereabouts. So yeah, we just have naturally attracted a kind of more even balance. It's almost 50-50. So that's something that we haven't had to think about so far. But I am aware that this evolves, that you hear of dating apps who have a kind of more even split in the early stages, and then as they grow, it becomes less even. So it's something that we're always monitoring and thinking about. And then in terms of same-sex couples, we don't really know where we sit as a benchmark because I haven't seen stats for other dating apps. But I think quite a lot of people who are looking for like same-sex partners do go to specific apps for that. So say like Her or Grindr. I think there's quite a few now. And that kind of does make sense because they will probably have a larger pool of people. In some ways, that's not to say I don't use other dating apps, but I can see why. And then, in terms of like inclusivity, we have, like many gender options. That's something that it's like really core to who we are as a company. Like the whole idea of So Synced is about inclusivity and celebrating differences. And that's something that I personally am just like really passionate about. And that's with personality types. I hope that we highlight this person is different from you. They think in a different way, but it's beautiful in a different way to how you are. And I am always really happy when people like come to us and they say, oh, your user base is so different. They're so much kinder and they're really thoughtful. And I'm like, yes, we're doing what we set out to do. And we do hear that quite a lot.
And that reminds me of a book, which I'm sure you've read or heard of, called Quiet. And it's the thesis of the book is about how wrong we've gotten it essentially as a society, where we assume that like extroversion is the better personality trait. And it talks about actually like the hidden power of introversion and how we've just utterly undervalued that as a society, but also massively overvalued extroversion and the impact that's had on suppressing talent or not recognizing talent. And it strikes me as you talk about it that this is something we can still get wrong, both in the startup space and more generally when we're hiring, is we overrate different traits. And a really good example is I was sat in a meeting once. I'm super extroverted, so I genuinely, part of the extroversion trait, as I understand it, is that you also think by speaking. And the introversion trait is that you're much more likely to have done your deep thought before a meeting, and that helps. And so when working, it's something that I've had to really adapt to because it wasn't my assumed way of working. I was like, well, everyone's like me. They can just get into a meeting and talk and it'll work. Yeah. And I think this is where we go really wrong sometimes as founding teams, particularly when we lead by a cult of our own leadership unintentionally, is that we reward behaviors that match us. So I went into a room previously and the leadership team were telling me afterwards, oh, we were really worried that people weren't talking. And I said, that's fine to be worried because there may be an issue where you need to actively include people more. But they were like, no, we're worried it's that they're not capable enough, that they're not thinking enough. And I said, well, actually, that could just be a totally different answer than the one you're looking at. It could be that they're going to go away and come back with some really smart ideas after it. Or it could be that actually it moved at a pace that didn't work because there was no provision for a different way of thinking. And so I think it's really important, just on a founder level, as we're building companies and cultures, that we understand these differences so that we can actively design from an inclusive perspective, even on just these personality traits. Is that something that actually founders maybe building teams could be more aware of, taking account of, and how that might look for the different personality types?
Yeah, so that's interesting because as an extroverted perceiver, you would be the ultimate type that would just go into a meeting, say your thoughts, clarify them as you're thinking, and just be very up for just like brainstorming, and things probably come quite quickly to you and you say them and you don't worry too much about what you're saying. Whereas if you take like the opposite personality type, or like introverts in general, actually their kind of inner world is more real to them in a way. So they always want to check what they're saying and doing with their inner world. So instead of just saying anything, they will be like, does this align with my values? Does this make sense to me? Is this logical? And they don't want to put anything out there unless they're sure that it does align with their kind of real inner world. And Quiet is such a great book and it was like life-changing for me. And as you mentioned, the world definitely is set up for extroverts and it rewards extroversion. And I think that's now changing to some extent. I think over the past 10 years, there's been a little bit of an introvert revolution, but not nearly enough. So I actually had a meeting with an investor, like we're not fundraising now, but still kind of meeting some investors. And it was a few weeks ago. And he said his personality type and I said mine, but actually we talked through it. So I was typing him there and then. So I told him his personality type. That's probably more accurate. And then later on, we were talking about his partner. He has a wife. And I was like, oh, tell me about your wife, because I'm always interested in people's other halves. And I said, is she extroverted or introverted? And I'd already said that I was an INFP, introverted. And he was like, oh, she's not introverted. She's not socially awkward. And I was like, oh, I was like, that, like there's still really big misconceptions. And I've had this quite a lot where like I say, oh, so you're probably more introverted, and people are really offended. They're like, no, I'm not an introvert. Like, I'm good at talking to people. And I'm like, no, it's completely not that. So there is definitely still more like education to be done, but there has been a massive improvement since say 10 years ago. And it's so important with management. Like I've had some great managers through my, I guess, like more corporate working career, but actually a lot of them did overvalue their own preferences and assumed that the traits that they have that people who work for them have as well. So one example is remote working versus being in an office. For a piece of work that requires a lot of concentration, introverts will tend to do much better if they're in a peaceful, kind of quiet environment, because they're more reactive to like external stimuli, and that's really distracting for them. Lots of extroverted managers like, you need to be in an office all the time, and that can be actually really detrimental to like their productivity and also just like their well-being in a way. So I think there's a lot more to be done around that as well. Kind of, personality types are used in the workplace to some extent, but I think not nearly enough.
And just a note on that for anyone who's listening and thinking, actually, maybe this is something I should bring into my company. Just a word of warning on that is that it so matters how you do it, because to your point, there is this, and I remember so vividly, we've done so many team dynamics workshops over the years. But one of the things that I think is really important is that it's not enough just to be like, oh, all personality types are great, because people will hear you and be like, but they're not. And every time I've done personality training, there is a perception in the room that some are better than others. Another example of this is, I remember there being a real bias around thinking being better than feeling in a business context.
Yeah.
And actually, and again, I think this is part of a wider movement of compassionate leadership, vulnerable leadership, empathetic leadership being valued. But I just think as leaders, it's a thing that sometimes we educate ourselves enough to be a little bit dangerous on. And I would encourage every leader to go and do some research and understand, but also lean into that empathetic side of how people who haven't done that research, haven't had that exposure yet, might still be carrying biases about what it means if they're on certain ends of the spectrum and how they feel that they're going to be perceived in the workplace. So rather than just being like, oh, this is your personality type, and then they're like, oh, but now I think everyone thinks I'm just going to go and cry all the time. And I do cry loads, by the way, as a feeler. But that's fine too. But I don't do it often in a business sense. And I didn't want that to change my perception of my capability and my analytical strengths. So again, just a note for anyone listening who leans into it, do so with compassion and thoughtfulness.
Really glad that you said that, because those kind of biases in terms of like work in particular, I think it happens. Like in personal life, like dating, friendships, different people tend to value different traits, and there's not super clear biases of which personality type is better to date or not. Like, we don't really see that. But in work, it can be really dangerous. And I'm like a similar personality type to you, INFP. And I've thought before, like, oh, I'd like to include like my personality type in my signature to like, it's just a fun thing to do, right? But then I'm like, there's lots of certain personality types who are investors who would probably be like, oh, she's not like the right personality type for a founder. Of course, like I tell people it if they ask, but it's not something that I necessarily want to tell everyone, particularly from a kind of business investing standpoint, because of like those biases. So yeah, hopefully they'll improve over time. It'll probably take a certain period, but hopefully we'll get there.
Okay, so I want to focus in for our last little chunk, firstly on some of the harder moments that you've been through. So what have they been and what have you taken from them? Not because I think every hard moment has to have a lesson, like sometimes they're just hard and you go, I actually couldn't avoid that again. But I think it's really helpful to share with other founders who are going through hard moments so that you don't feel like it's just you if you're listening and you're in one of those moments. So maybe we can go into some of those and talk through where there were lessons, let's share. Where there's not, let's acknowledge that they're just rubbish.
Yeah, so I think one of the hardest moments was realizing that we had to build everything from scratch. So I said we built a test app. We just thought, oh, we'll make some adjustments and it'll be fine. So then when we realized, when our kind of CTO was like, this is not going to scale well, you need to build everything from scratch. That was so shocking because we'd scraped together like money to build this platform. And that was another reason why we definitely need to fundraise now, because we can't build this again. Like, we need the money to do this. That, I remember that just sitting in my bedroom being like, we need quite a lot of money to rebuild this, or a lot more than we had. So that was a kind of tough moment. I would say fundraising in general was like, it wasn't one moment in particular, but that whole period, particularly that first fundraise, was not easy. And then also closing the round, actually pretty stressful. We had to do it because of SES, EIS within a certain time frame. And it just felt like everything went wrong. So it was like an extra couple of months at the end. We had an investor who, his wife left him and then he ghosted us. And it was when we'd done all the legal documents, I was just waiting for his signature and I just couldn't get hold of him. And I was like, okay. And I eventually managed to get hold of someone who knew him. And he was like, oh yeah, he will invest. And then waited another few days. And then eventually came back and said, oh, he's not going to invest. I had to like redo all the legal documents. And that was all a bit stressful. And then we also had like an overseas transfer that basically got caught up in these like KYC checks. So it disappeared. Like this, it was one of our biggest kind of amounts that had been invested. And that was super stressful because the kind of exchange that it was going through was like, oh, we can't say anything. And the banks were like, oh, it's left our bank. And the other bank was like, oh, it hasn't arrived in ours. So that was like super stressful because we had this like time frame. And it actually closed the day before the end of the tax year. So I basically didn't sleep for those last 4 weeks. I was like just super stressed the whole time. So I'm very glad that is out the way. And yeah, I guess just ups and downs in terms of like testing different acquisition channels, expecting one to be good and then it's not, and like vice versa as well. But I think, yeah, those are the kind of main tough parts. And then actually, yeah, during our second fundraise, my mum was actually really ill. So yeah, she's like better now. So that's a kind of another factor. Like you often have like personal things, or not often, but sometimes have like big personal things going on top of like really stressful kind of business moments. And that's hard to deal with.
And I guess specifically in your context, harder because it's then both co-founders are going through the same thing, which normally, at least if you've got one of you who's got to drop out or take a step back, you hope that you're not hit by the same personal crisis. But
yeah,
that's a lot to weather. You have weathered it. What is your focus now? What is coming up for Succinct? And what are you focused on testing next and exploring next?
Yeah, so I guess really big picture, we do want to build out Succinct in lots of different ways. So one of my main learnings from setting up the company is that everyone spends so much time like finding their partner and they don't this isn't true for everyone, but a lot of people don't really take the time to do self-work and look inwards and be like, oh, am I the best version of myself for when I meet this amazing partner? So we'd like to do more around that. So pre-meeting partner kind of personal development. And then also the part after meeting your person as well, where I find it fascinating that I think the average amount spent on a wedding in the UK is £30,000. And people will spend that, but then they won't fully invest time in like making sure they're communicating properly with, and the divorce rate is super high, right? And I'm like, oh my God, people are spending a lot of money on weddings, but actually not really taking the time to use proper tools and make sure that their relationship is best it can be. And yeah, again, that's not true for everyone, but that is definitely a trend. So what we want to do long term is kind of have tools, like maybe it's a separate app, I think it probably will be, where people can use personality types to understand their partners and potentially friends eventually as well. There's lots of different ways, but yeah, for now we'll focus on that whole like relationship funnel in a way, if that makes sense.
Love that. Very excited to see that. Okay, final 2 quickfire questions. First one, what is the thing you are proudest of that you've achieved with So Synced?
Yeah, probably the team, building the team that we have and how adaptable they are. With this new funding environment in particular, we actually launched our membership package before the downturn, but it's been even more important to focus on revenue. And like right now, actually, we're on this path to profitability and we're not too far away, which is super exciting. Like that in itself is a great thing. But yeah, so I think when we saw this downturn starting, which was early last year, people's roles like did actually change overnight in some cases. Like our strategy now is to focus on revenue, and that required like a different setup of the company. And so we had like this big kind of strategy day where we're like, okay, we were focusing more on this and now it's going to be more on revenue and maybe not profitability at the time, but now it definitely is. And everyone just took it in their stride. They just got on with it. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. We are very lucky to have such a competent and like adaptable team. So I think, yeah, that's the thing that I'm most proud of.
Pretty great thing to be proud of. Final question. What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
So the best piece of advice that I've ever been given that I actually, unfortunately, didn't listen to at first. Very grateful for, this kind of advisor that we have. He said, build a company for users, not for investors. And it's so true. But at the time I was like, raising the next round of funding, we need X amount of growth per month. And he's like, but is that really the best for like the business and your user base, your audience? And looking back, our focus was too much on kind of metrics that I knew people would want to see. And it was probably kind of detrimental in some ways to the business. And we've learned lessons from that. And now we don't do that. But yeah, that's the best piece of advice that I did not take, embarrassingly, but I definitely have taken that on board now.
It's such an easy trap to fall into though, because you feel like without the investment, I can't do the business. So you're like, this is best for the business. It's easy to like back engineering it. I think I know so many founders who'd say the exact same thing. So brilliant advice. And if you can listen to it, I know it's not an easy one, but it's great advice. Jess, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been, great to chat.
Thank you for listening. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please do take a moment to rate and share. It really does make a huge difference to our growth. And for more founder oh shit moments, success stories, and the insights behind them both, do subscribe today. And for those of you curious what I get up to when not interviewing founders for this show, I have a new startup, If We Raise, aiming to get expertise and capital to underrepresented founders earlier. You can follow what my co-founder Tim and I are up to via @IfWeRaiseTogether on Instagram or @IfWeRaise on LinkedIn and Twitter. We'll be sharing our lessons learned along the way, as well as highlighting the incredible founders and angel investors joining the If We Raise journey.